Welcome to Core Issues. Let's take a deeper look. And the theme of lessons that are going to help you overcome your anxiety, be able to embrace being an introvert in a way that'll help you. We want to talk now about the core issues. So I'd like to use the analogy what I call the two paddle approach. Now, you picture yourself in a canoe, okay? If I were to tell you, all right, you can only paddle on your right side and that's it, what's going to happen to the canoe? Well, of course, you're going to go in a circle. Now, of course, you're going to make movement. You're going to go somewhere. That energy that you put out is going to have an effect, but you're going to end up right back where you started. Now, if I were to tell you, all right, go ahead and paddle evenly on both sides of the canoe, what happens? You go straight and you actually get somewhere. This is, again, what I call the two paddle approach, and I believe this is the best way to work on making changes for ourselves and becoming the person that we want to be. So, in an effort to not do circles, we have to handle things in two ways. And the first is what I call a cognitive behavioral approach, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the second is insight-oriented therapy. So the lessons we've done before is more of this cognitive behavioral approach. So we identify the thought patterns, the things that we're telling ourselves, and then making a change by applying something new. So just basically changing the script, the message that we give ourselves. Okay. The second part is, again, this insight-oriented. All right. So this is what's usually fueling the behaviors that are going on. This is what is making us do things that are self-destructive, making us believe negative things about ourselves. And this comes from within inside. This comes from beliefs we have about ourselves. Now, of course, this can come from early on experiences. This can come from how we were raised, the messages that we heard. This can come from things that are bigger, like trauma, difficult experiences that we've had. But basically, this is like the fuel, okay, that keeps fueling out the behaviors that occur. So if we can cut off that fuel, right, then we have fewer behaviors. Now, understand too, if you just take one approach over the other, you're going to see some results, but not lasting. So for instance, let's say we just take the cognitive behavioral therapy approach. We just implement skills to change behaviors. We are going to start feeling better. We are going to create new habits. But it's going to be really hard because that core issue is still fueling us. Now, if we just cut off that fuel, again, and just figure out what's going on the inside of us, granted, we're no longer creating new behaviors, but those behaviors that we've already established are going to continue unless we extinguish those. So the best approach is both. All right, so again, we've talked about some of these cognitive behavioral approaches. We talked about the catch, challenge, change. We've talked about thinking errors, reconstructing that, changing our thoughts and those patterns. These are the lessons we've done previous. Now we're going to talk about getting down to the nitty-gritty, what's the core. So the technique to do this, so we can understand what our core issue is, it's called the downward arrow technique. All right. This technique will help you pinpoint the self-defeating beliefs that make you vulnerable to depression and anxiety. For example, you may be a perfectionist and base your self-esteem entirely on your accomplishments. Now you're noticing that these cells here are a little bit bigger than most of the other presentations that I've done with you. All right. I want you to be able to look back at this and read some of this. This is a little more complicated. This is a little more heady, but this is good stuff. All right. So basically, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna teach you a technique to help you get down to what's underneath all the other stuff, so you know again what's fueling some of your beliefs about yourself, the messages you give yourself. Okay, so let's apply this downward arrow technique. So let me read through this, and then I'm gonna run through an example with you. Okay, so to use this technique, draw a downward arrow under a negative thought and ask yourself, why would it be upsetting to me if this thought were true? What would it mean to me? A new negative thought will come to mind. Write it down under the arrow and repeat the process several times. The NTs, or negative thoughts, you generate will lead to the underlying beliefs at the core of your suffering. Okay, So get out a piece of paper. I want you to go ahead and write down a negative self-statement. All right? Now let me give you an example. Let's say it is, gosh, you know what? At work now, I'm working on a project, and if I don't get this right, my boss is going to get upset with me, and it has to be just perfect. All right? So you'd write down that statement, or at least a little bit of that statement, and then draw an arrow underneath that. Okay, what does that mean? What would that mean to you? Well, if I don't get this presentation right, my boss doesn't like it, then I may not get that raise. Okay, write that down, draw another arrow on that piece of paper. Next thought. Okay, again, what would that mean to you? What would be the outcome for you? Well, I mean, if I don't get that raise, that means that my boss won't like me. It means I'm at a threat of losing my job. Okay, put another arrow down there. Again, what would that mean? What would it mean if you lost your job? Well, if I lost my job, that would mean it would be really hard to find another job, and people would see me for the fake that I am, and that I don't know what I'm doing. Okay. Now you've reached the bottom. All right. So you go through this process until you get down to where you can go no further. Okay. So what is the issue there? You feel like you're a fraud. Boom. Your core issue's been established. Feeling like you're a fraud. Now you're probably asking yourself, can I have more than one core issue? Well, absolutely. But what you want to do is find those self-statements, those negative self-statements that you give yourself the most often. Okay, the self-statements that you worry about the most. Then do the downward arrow and see where it leads to. I think you're going to find a common theme, and you're not going to find much more than 2 to 3 core issues. All right, and often those core issues come down to just one word. Okay, that word can be acceptance, love, again, being a fraud, and so forth. So that's the downward arrow technique. Take some time and do that. All right, now we're going to talk about what's called the hidden emotion technique. So what is this? Okay, again, I'm going to read this so you can read through it too. And please refer back to this presentation, this lesson. Okay, what is it? This technique is based on the idea that when you're anxious, you may be avoiding a personal problem that you don't want to face. Bringing this problem to conscious awareness and expressing your feelings will eliminate your anxiety. Okay, so basically what this is we will do things to distract ourselves from really what's going on. Okay, so let's apply this. Ask yourself, am I focusing on my anxiety to avoid dealing with something upsetting? What's the real problem that's bothering me? Do I secretly resent my spouse or my job? Am I unhappy about being in school? How do I really feel? Okay, so again, this feeling of anxiety, this feeling of inadequacy is manifesting itself through the anxiety. And oftentimes, and I'm sure you've talked with people where they say, oh, I'm just anxious right now. I'm just worried. Well, what's your worry about? I don't know, I'm just worried. Well, there's usually a reason. And so what can happen is that worry and anxiety can be what we call a secondary gain. In other words, I feel that, therefore I can avoid. Okay? What you need to do is you need to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. All right? That anxiety, that worry can be, again, a thinking error. All right? What's the secondary emotion underneath? Like in the example here, do I secretly resent my spouse or my job? Am I unhappy about school? How am I really feeling? Okay, so push away the worry, push away the anxiety. What's really underneath? All right, now let's talk a little bit about self-defeating beliefs. Okay, this is the mask for the core issue. All right, so we often hear about that classic, tell me about your childhood. And as a therapist, as you can imagine, I've worked with a lot of people who have worked through issues that stem from very early on in their life and stem from relationships and with their parents and teachers and other mentors in life that either let them down or, again, in the positive realm, built them up. Okay. What I do is I tell individuals that I work with, and so I'm going to coach you on this, and that is, I'll ask you, what is your earliest memory where you felt limited? In other words, where you felt like you were capped off of what your capabilities were, where you felt less than, where you felt you could only do so much, where your beliefs just limited yourself. Go back to that time. Go back to that moment. Maybe first grade, maybe kindergarten, maybe sometime in high school. Remember that incident, okay? And then what I want you to do is I want you to go back, okay? Think about it, review it. Think about how it made you feel physically. What are the physical things that you're feeling as you recall this incident? How are you feeling emotionally, mentally, physically? And then look at yourself now. And what I guarantee is that you're a different person now in that you've overcome a lot since then. But that early experience can really anchor you back to that moment. What I want you to do now, I'm going to coach you through a little bit what we call inner child work. I want you to go ahead and tell yourself, okay, here I am. Let's say your name's Jim. I want the old Jim, the current Jim, to go back and visit that young Jim, back to that moment where you felt that limiting belief. And tell that young Jim, look, you know what, you're okay. We've made it. Yeah, life's tough, and it's still tough. We still have challenges. But you've progressed much further than you thought you were able to. And tell yourself that. This is one of the best ways to work through some of those anchored, limited beliefs. Okay. Life interfering behaviors. What do you do to avoid? Okay. Classic head in the sand. What are the things that you do when you should be doing something else? So, and I think as adults, we often do things that are good, but not better or best. So, for instance, going back to the work situation we talked about earlier, let's say you have a project you have to work on and you're feeling just overwhelmed because of the fear, the core fear of what might happen, right, if you don't get it right. So what do? We may decide, well, you know what, I actually need to go clean the garage right now, right? We do all these avoiding behaviors, right? We find things that, no, it's important. We need to do this. And we avoid the very thing that we need to be working on because, again, of that fear, okay? So be aware of what your life interfering behaviors are on a daily basis. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. This one's a little tough. You're going to probably want to review this one a few times. But please take a look at this and review this as many times as you need to. Thanks.